I want to tell you about the 3 seconds of silence that changed my entire life, not the slap itself, though I will absolutely get to that, but the 3 seconds after it. The moment when the room full of people who had been laughing and passing dishes and complimenting the centerpiece went completely, utterly still. The moment when 26 people turned and looked at me. My hand went to my cheek before I even understood why. The sting spread in a slow, hot ring across my face, and I stood there in the middle of that dining room thinking one clear thought: so this is who we really are. My mother-in-law had just slapped me across the face at a family birthday party, in front of everyone, while I was 12 weeks pregnant with her grandchild, and my husband, my steady, dependable, good-tipping husband, was standing 6 feet away. He did not move. That was the moment I understood everything. Not the slap, the 6 feet of silence. But let me back up, because the ending only makes sense once you know the beginning, and the beginning started with a woman named Renata, and 2 years of trying very hard to be loved by someone who had already decided not to love me. My name is Jolie Mercer. I'm 26 years old, and for 2 of those years I was married to a man named Connor. The kind of man who holds the elevator for strangers, always tips 20%, and called his mother every single morning before he finished his first cup of coffee. For the longest time, I thought that last part was sweet. I know now it was a warning sign I mistook for a personality trait. Renata was 63 years old, sharp as a tack, and had raised Connor alone after losing his father when Connor was 12. She had built a life from that loss, rebuilt herself, rebuilt their little family of 2. And somewhere in that process, the love she had for her son had curdled into something else, something that looked like devotion from the outside but felt, from the inside, more like ownership. She had not chosen me. This was clear from the very first dinner, when she asked about my family background with the careful interest of someone conducting a background check rather than getting to know a person. It stayed clear through 2 years of Sunday dinners and holiday gatherings and birthday celebrations, where I brought wine she accepted without comment, contributed to conversations she redirected without acknowledgement, and smiled until my face ached at a woman who looked through me like I was a window she was waiting to clean. I had been patient, genuinely, deeply patient, not the performed kind where you are actually seething underneath. I understood that letting go of a child you raised alone is genuinely hard, and I gave that understanding freely. I brought flowers. I asked about her garden. I learned which casserole recipe she considered superior to all others, and complimented it every time she made it, which was often, because she made it strategically. I made effort. I kept making effort. 3 years of it, and then I found out I was pregnant. I want to be very specific about how I felt in that moment. Completely, unreservedly happy. 8 weeks along, confirmed at the doctor, a small blurry image on a printout that I had looked at approximately 47 times before Connor came home that evening. I told him over dinner. He cried. I cried. We sat at our kitchen table holding hands like 2 people who had just received news so good it needed to be handled carefully, like something that might spill. We decided to tell Renata together that Sunday. Connor said she would be thrilled. He had been wrong about his mother before. This was the wrongest he had ever been. Her response, when we told her, was to look at me for a long moment and say, "Well, that's a development. Not joy, not tears, not congratulations. A development." Like I had announced a weather change. Like this baby, our baby, Connor's baby, her future grandchild, was a complication she was evaluating rather than a miracle she was receiving. Connor laughed nervously and said of course it was a wonderful development. Renata smiled at him with the warmth she reserved exclusively for him. A warmth that stopped at the edge of whatever space I occupied in the room, and said she supposed that was true. Then she asked if we had thought it through, asked about finances, asked about the apartment, asked with the gentle persistence of someone building a case whether this had been planned. I drove home that evening in the passenger seat of our car, watching the streetlights pass, thinking about what it felt like to be 12 weeks pregnant and have your mother-in-law respond to the news with the word development. And I thought, something is going to have to give. I just didn't know yet that it would happen at a birthday party in front of 26 people with an open palm. And hey, if you're here watching this, I just want to say thank you, genuinely. Drop a comment and tell me where you're watching from and what time it is there. I love knowing who's out there with me. It means more than you know. What followed the pregnancy announcement was a masterclass in subtle warfare. Renata did not yell. She did not make scenes. She did not do anything that could be pointed to directly and called out, because Renata was far too skilled for that. What she did was apply pressure the way water applies pressure. Constantly, from every direction, so gradually that you almost don't notice the walls are moving until you are already in a smaller room than you started in. The Sunday visits became occasions for concern, not cruel concern, helpful concern, the kind delivered with a tilted head and a warm voice. She worried the apartment was too small for a baby. She worried the neighborhood wasn't ideal. She wondered aloud, just wondering, whether Connor had thought about what this would mean for his career trajectory, because babies were expensive, and she just wanted to make sure he had really thought it through. She said these things to Connor, always to Connor, and I sat across the table and watched my husband nod along with the expression of a man who had been trained since childhood to receive his mother's worries as facts. He did not disagree with her. He did not say anything in my defense. But he also, I told myself, did not agree with her. He was just processing. He would come around. I had been using the phrase come around to reassure myself about both Connor and Renata for 2 years, which in retrospect tells you something about the ground I was standing on. She started calling twice a day instead of once. Connor always answered. The morning call I had grown accustomed to, but now there was an evening call too, sometimes stretching to 45 minutes, and sometimes, when Connor emerged from these calls, he was quieter than he had been before them. When I asked what they talked about, he said, "Oh, nothing, just checking in." I learned to hear the nothing as something. She came by the apartment unannounced twice in the space of 3 weeks, both times bearing casseroles I had not requested and opinions about the spare room I had not asked for. The first time, I was gracious. The second time, I was gracious through effort. By the third unannounced visit, which never happened, because I had quietly started texting her a request to call ahead, which she received without acknowledgement and honored inconsistently, I understood that the apartment was not a home she was visiting. It was a territory she was assessing. The most telling moment, the one that showed me most clearly what I was actually dealing with, happened on a Tuesday evening when I arrived home from work to find Renata already there. Connor had let her in. They were sitting at the kitchen table with what looked like printed pages between them. When I came in, Renata gathered the papers smoothly, not hastily. She never did anything hastily. And said she should be getting home, and Connor said he would walk her to the car, and when he came back inside, he said she had just brought over some information about neighborhoods. Neighborhoods. Printed out and laid on our kitchen table while I was at work. I asked which neighborhoods. He said, just some options she was looking at. I said, options for what? He said, nothing, just ideas. I sat down at our kitchen table where Renata's papers had been, and I thought about the word ideas, about how ideas become suggestions, become expectations, become assumptions about things that were never discussed, about how slowly that process moved, and how completely you could be relocated by it without ever having agreed to go. I was 14 weeks pregnant by then. I was tired in the particular exhausting way of early pregnancy, and I was tired in the different, longer-running way of 2 years of trying to hold my place in a marriage that had a third person in it who had never been invited and never left. And then came the birthday party. Renata's sister, Margaret, was turning 65. The gathering was at Margaret's house. 30 people, family and close friends, people who had known Connor since he was in middle school and who greeted me with the warmth of people who had accepted me as an addition to the category of Connor's life without ever quite including me in the original text. It was the kind of gathering where Renata was completely in her element. She knew everyone, had history with everyone, was the person at the center of every conversation she joined. I had dressed carefully, not to impress anyone. I was past dressing to impress Renata's circle. That project had run its course. But because I have always believed that how you carry yourself in a room says something about how you feel about yourself, and I wanted to feel like myself that evening. The first 2 hours were fine. Dinner was served, conversations ran their natural courses. I sat beside Connor's cousin Adele, who was the family member I genuinely liked and who was funny in the dry, understated way of someone who had been watching family dynamics with clear eyes for a long time. We talked about her new job, about the city, about the inexplicable popularity of a particular television program we had both been watching against our better judgment. I was, from the outside, perfectly present and pleasant. Renata had been watching me for most of the evening. I was used to being watched by her. It had a specific quality. Assessing, measuring, looking for the things she had not found yet in 2 years of looking. That evening it had a different quality. Tighter. Like someone who has made a decision and is waiting for the right moment. The moment arrived when someone across the table asked how far along I was, and I answered, and someone made a kind remark about how I was glowing, which is a thing people say to pregnant women regardless of whether it is literally true. And Renata said, from 3 seats down, clearly, in a voice that carried, that she hoped Jolie understood what it actually meant to put a child's needs before her own. The table went a little quiet. I said evenly that I thought I had a fairly good idea. She said she wasn't sure that was true. And in the silence that followed that sentence, something in Renata's face shifted. Something that had been building and pressurizing for 2 years found its direction. She stood up. She crossed the room. And she slapped me open-handed hard across the face in front of 26 people at her sister's birthday party while I was 12 weeks pregnant with her son's child. The room went completely, absolutely still. Connor was 6 feet away. He did not move. The first person to move was Adele. She was across the table and at my side before anyone else had finished processing what had just happened. Before Renata had fully lowered her hand, before the sound of it had stopped ringing in the room. She put her hand on my arm, looked at my face with the specific attention of someone assessing rather than reacting, and said quietly, "Are you all right?" And then, before I could answer, she turned to the room, to the 26 frozen faces, to Renata standing with her chin elevated in the manner of someone who considers herself justified, to Connor, still 6 feet away, still not having moved. Adele said in a clear, calm, carrying voice, "Everyone in this room just saw that. Not a question. A record being established." I said I needed some air. Adele came with me. We went to the front porch and I sat on the top step and pressed my hand very gently against my cheek, which was hot and stinging, and I breathed the November air, which was cold and sharp and clarifying. I sat there, and I thought, with a focus that surprised me given the circumstances, about what I was holding. What I was holding was this: 26 witnesses, an act that could not be explained away or softened or reframed into something it wasn't. A husband who had watched it happen from 6 feet away and made a choice, which was that not choosing was itself a choice, the loudest one available to him. A pregnancy that made what had just happened not just a personal humiliation, but something with legal weight. Adele sat beside me without speaking for several minutes, which was exactly right. When she finally said something, it was, "What do you need from me?" I said, "I need you to be willing to say what you saw if it comes to that." She said, "I already said it, and I'll say it again anywhere you need me to." Inside, I could hear the sounds of a party that had not ended, but had changed completely. The low murmur of people who have witnessed something they cannot unknow. The shuffling recalibration of a room full of people deciding what to do with what they have just seen. I could hear Renata's voice, confident, managing, narrating something I couldn't make out. I could hear Connor's voice, quieter, somewhere near her. Not near me, near her. My sister, when I called her from the car on the way home, Adele drove me. Connor did not come looking for me for 45 minutes, a detail I filed carefully. Said 3 things in the practical, direct manner of someone who has always been better in a crisis than in ordinary times. Go to an urgent care or ER tonight and get the injury documented. Take photographs right now in good light and call a family law attorney first thing in the morning. I did all 3. The medical record noted bruising and soft tissue impact on the left cheek, consistent with a blunt force contact. The photographs my sister took that night were clear and time-stamped, and by the time I called Claire Webb at 8:45 the following morning, I had already received 7 text messages from people who had been in Margaret's dining room the previous evening. All of them said some version of the same thing. I saw what happened. I'm sorry. Whatever you need. 7 people, unsolicited, before I had asked anyone for anything. Renata had struck me in front of 26 people because she had believed she was untouchable, because she had managed her position in this family and in her community for 63 years and believed it was solid enough to absorb anything, because she had always been the person who controlled the narrative, and she had not considered the possibility that this particular narrative was 26 people wide. That was her first mistake. She was about to make several more. Claire Webb had a calm, organized manner and asked very precise questions, and when I finished laying out everything she said, "You have more documentation than most people who come to me." Then she said, "The question is what you want to do with it." I told her I wanted to do everything correctly and completely. I told her I wanted everyone involved to know exactly what had happened before any formal process began. I told her I had thought about it carefully and that I was not acting from panic or from pain. I was acting from clarity, which is a different thing entirely and considerably more useful. She said she could work with that. She said she would begin preparing documents. I drove home from that meeting through a clear December morning, feeling something I had not felt in 2 years of Sundays and casseroles and unannounced visits and a husband who answered every call. I felt like I was standing on solid ground. What I didn't know yet was that while I was sitting in Claire's office making careful plans, Renata was making plans of her own, and that Connor, my steady, dependable husband, was about to make the worst financial decision of his life in the service of those plans. What Renata did next told me more about her character than 2 years of Sunday dinners ever had. She made calls, not apology calls. I want to be very clear that in the days following the birthday party, Renata did not call me, did not send a message, did not communicate any version of what happened that acknowledged what she had done. What she communicated to the people she communicated with was a version of events in which she had been provoked, had reacted poorly in a moment of stress, and in which the situation was being blown considerably out of proportion by a daughter-in-law who had always been difficult. Difficult. That was the word she used, I was told by more than one person who thought I should know. But the calls she made that concerned me more were a different kind entirely. Claire informed me, through the appropriate professional channels, that someone had been in contact with someone who knew someone in the direction of the police report I had filed. The nature of the contact was, according to Claire, the kind that is sometimes made when someone with social capital and a network tries to make an inconvenient thing go away quietly before it becomes public. It didn't work. It never works the way people who try it think it will. And Claire said so with the expression of someone who has watched this particular miscalculation play out many times. What it did instead was create a documented record of an attempt to interfere with a legal proceeding, which is its own category of problem that is generally worse than the original problem it was trying to address. Renata had money and connections and 63 years of knowing the right people. What she did not have was 26 witnesses who had already put things in writing before she had time to call any of them. Connor, meanwhile, had done something I had not expected. He hired a defense attorney for his mother. This again was his right. I understood it. He loved his mother. He believed, or had convinced himself to believe, that the situation was more complicated than it looked and that she needed representation. I did not begrudge him the impulse, even if I found it devastating in what it said about where his loyalties resided when they were tested. What I did note, when Claire showed me the joint account statement, was where the money for that attorney came from, our savings account. The one we had opened together 3 years ago with a note in the memo field that said house fund, the one we had been adding to every month, the disciplined and careful work of 2 people building toward a future, the one that had, over 3 years, accumulated to $43,000. Money we had planned to use for a down payment before the baby arrived because we had talked about wanting our child to come home to a house and not an apartment, because that had meant something to us when we discussed it. It had meant something to me anyway. 2 payments. Harold Briggs, attorney at law. $43,000 gone. Connor had spent the house fund defending the woman who had struck his pregnant wife in front of 26 people. I want to give you a moment with that because I needed a moment with it myself. I sat with that bank statement for a long time, not crying. I had moved past the crying stage, which had lasted about 4 days and had been necessary and was now over. But just sitting with it, letting it be fully real. $43,000. 3 years of the 15th of every month. The note that said house fund. Claire, when I showed it to her, was quiet for a few seconds. Then she said, "This is going to matter in the settlement." She said it the way attorneys say extremely relevant when they are being professionally restrained about it. I told her to include everything. While all of this was unfolding, I was doing my own preparation. Quietly, methodically, in the way I had learned to do things when they mattered. I gathered the complete financial picture. Every joint account, every asset, every liability. I compiled the documentation of Renata's attempt to interfere with the case, which Claire's office had obtained through appropriate channels. I kept every message from the 7 witnesses and followed up with each of them, gently and without pressure, to confirm their willingness to speak officially if needed. All 7 said yes. I also, in this period, told my family. My sister already knew. My parents, when I told them, responded in the way my parents have always responded to things that threaten their children, with a controlled fury that they immediately converted into practical action. My father, who was a methodical man and had never particularly warmed to Connor in the first place, a fact he had the grace not to say out loud more than twice, said, "What do you need?" My mother said the same thing, but made a casserole while she said it, which I ate for 3 days and found genuinely comforting. Connor, in this period, was living in the apartment. We were civil to each other in the specific, careful way of 2 people who have lawyers and are not supposed to discuss certain things. He moved around the apartment with the expression of a man who had made a series of decisions that had each seemed defensible in isolation and was only now beginning to understand what they added up to. He had spent the house fund. He had stood 6 feet away and not moved. He had spent the week since defending Renata's version of events to the people in their shared social circle. And he had, I was told by Adele, who had become, in this period, the member of Connor's family I was most grateful to know, made it clear to his mother that he was on her side. He had gotten what Renata had always wanted. He had chosen her. I was counting on them both to live with that choice. The hearing was on a Thursday morning in January. I was 16 weeks pregnant, visibly so, and I had dressed carefully. Navy, structured. the kind of outfit that communicates that you are taking this seriously without performing distress. Harold Briggs was, by all professional accounts, a competent defense attorney. I want to acknowledge this because the outcome had nothing to do with the quality of the lawyering. Harold Briggs was working with a difficult set of facts, and he worked them as well as they could be worked. The problem was not his preparation. The problem was 26 witnesses, a medical record, photographs, documented evidence of attempted case interference, and a room full of people who had been there and had said what they saw before anyone could suggest otherwise. Renata sat at the defense table in a dove-gray blazer and maintained the composed expression of a woman who had spent 63 years controlling how she appeared in rooms. She was very good at it. I will give her that, genuinely. She was composed and upright and dignified in a way that I imagine she had practiced, and under different circumstances in a different room, I might have found it impressive. She held it until Adele took the stand. Adele was not a dramatic witness. She spoke without embellishment or performance, in the clear, factual manner of someone who has decided to tell the complete truth and has no investment in anything except the truth being heard. She described what she had seen: Renata rising from her chair, crossing the room, the contact, the sound, the stillness that followed. She described Connor's position. She described his non-response, not with judgment in her voice, just as a fact she had observed and was reporting accurately. When Harold Briggs cross-examined her and suggested the possibility that the situation had been ambiguous, that emotions had been running high, that perhaps what had appeared one way might be understood differently from another angle, Adele looked at him with the patient expression of someone who has been asked to reconsider something she has no intention of reconsidering. She said, "I was standing 8 feet away. I watched it happen. There was no other way to understand it. 4 more witnesses said similar things. 2 of them, independently, described Connor's position in the room and his non-response, because they had noticed it and it had stayed with them. Not because they had been asked to notice it, just because it was the kind of thing a person notices when someone's husband stands 6 feet away and doesn't move. The attempted interference, Renata's calls, the quiet pressure applied in the wrong directions, was entered into the record. Harold Briggs had nothing useful to say about it because there is nothing useful to say about it. You either made the calls or you didn't, and Renata had made them, and they were documented. The finding was simple assault. The sentence was a fine and a mandatory anger management program. The fine Renata paid without visible distress. The anger management program was, I was told, a different matter. 12 sessions, Thursday evenings, in a church basement in her own neighborhood, with a facilitator who had a master's degree in conflict resolution and zero interest in anyone's social standing. Renata attended all 12 sessions because she had no choice. What she got from them, if anything, is between her and the facilitator and whatever version of herself she was willing to look at in that basement. But that was not the part of the reckoning that stayed with me. The part that stayed with me came in the divorce proceedings, when the joint account withdrawal became the center of a conversation that I believe Harold Briggs had not fully prepared Connor for. Claire presented the timeline clearly: the assault, the filing, and then, 17 days after the assault, a withdrawal of $43,000 from a joint marital account to pay for the legal defense of a third party in a case directly arising from harm done to the other account holder. She presented it without drama, just as a sequence of facts, and let the judge look at the statement for as long as the judge wanted to look at it. The judge looked at it for a while. The settlement required Connor to account for the withdrawal. The $43,000 was factored in as an unauthorized use of marital funds. The house fund, the 3 years of the 15th of every month, the note that said house fund, all of it came back. Not to a joint account. To me. Connor sat across from me at the settlement meeting and said nothing for a long time after the terms were read. He looked like a man who had been very certain that love was a sufficient defense for the decisions he had made, and had just understood that it wasn't. He looked like a man who had spent the house fund and received, in return, a mother who had now completed an anger management program and a legal record that followed her name. He had chosen her. He had gotten what he chose. I signed the papers. I picked up my bag. I walked out into a January afternoon that was cold and bright and entirely mine. Spring came into my new apartment on the 4th floor like it owned the place, which, as far as I was concerned, it did. I had signed the lease in February, moved in over a long weekend with the help of my sister and my father, and a rental truck my father drove with the focused intensity of a man on a mission, and by the time the cherry trees on the street below started doing their thing in April, the apartment felt like mine in the particular way that spaces feel like yours, when every single object in them was chosen by you alone. The couch was a color Connor would have called too much. I called it exactly right. The nursery was painted a soft sage green that my sister and I debated for 3 weekends before settling on, and which turned out to be perfect in the afternoon light, which is the kind of thing you only know after you've committed, and I am glad we committed. There was a mobile above the crib that played a song I had loved since I was small, and a rocking chair by the window that had belonged to my grandmother and that my mother had driven 4 hours to deliver personally, arriving with the chair strapped into the back seat of her car and a look of complete satisfaction on her face. I had rebuilt the savings account. Not $43,000 yet. That took time. But I had started, and the starting was what mattered. And every month on the 15th, I added to it, because old habits from a previous life can be repurposed, and this one was worth keeping. What I had not rebuilt and did not try to rebuild was any version of the life I had left. Some things you leave on purpose, and the purpose is the point. Renata's standing in her community did not collapse overnight. These things rarely do. People who have spent decades managing their social position do not lose it all at once. What happened instead was the specific, steady deflation of authority that occurs when 26 people who were in a room compare what they saw with what they were subsequently told. The version Renata had circulated, in which she had been provoked, had reacted in a moment of stress, was being treated unfairly by a difficult daughter-in-law, ran headlong into the accounts of 26 people who had been there and remembered differently. The people who had accepted her version of events for 30 years found themselves revising their acceptance, not dramatically, but in the quiet and permanent way of people who have updated their understanding of something. The woman who had always been right, who had always known best, who had spent 63 years being the person whose word settled things, had slapped her pregnant daughter-in-law at a birthday party and then tried to buy her way out of the record of it. That is a difficult thing to manage your way back from. The composure and the gray blazer do not cover it. Connor lost something harder to name and slower to repair. He had been, for 30 years, effortlessly well-liked. The easy, uncomplicated regard of people who find someone likable and never have cause to examine why. He'd been the good guy, the dependable one, the elevator holder, the generous tipper, the man who coached his nephew's little league and called his mother every morning. People had liked him without thinking about it, which is the most durable kind of being liked. And then he had stood 6 feet away from his pregnant wife and not moved. The people who had always liked him without thinking about it were now thinking about it, not viciously. This was not a social execution. No one organized anything. No one coordinated. It was simply the quiet, organic consequence of people knowing what happened and adjusting their picture of a person accordingly. Some adjustments are small. Some are the kind you don't recover from, not because people are cruel, but because the information changes the picture and the picture cannot be changed back. I did not engineer any of this. I want to be very clear about that. I filed a police report. I told the truth, I let Claire do her job, and I moved into an apartment on the 4th floor with a sage green nursery. Everything else arrived on its own, through the ordinary mechanism of truth, traveling in a community of people who had been present for something real. Adele called me in March to check in. She asked how I was doing. I said considerably better than fine, which made her laugh. She said she'd been thinking about me and wanted me to know that. I said I was glad she had been there that night, not just for what she said, but for how she said it. That 3 seconds everyone in this room just saw that had changed the shape of what was possible. She said, I only said what was true. Anyone in that room could have said it. I said, but you were the one who did. She said she would like to meet the baby when the time came. I said I would like that very much. The baby, who had been through considerably more in her first 16 weeks of existence than most people manage in years, was, according to every checkup, doing beautifully. She had a strong heartbeat and a preference for kicking at 10 in the evening, which my doctor said was completely normal and which I found funny and slightly exhausting in the way of things that are both at once. She was coming in June. I had everything ready. I was not afraid of any of it. My daughter was born on a Tuesday in June, 7 pounds and 2 ounces, with a full head of dark hair and the expression of someone who has just arrived somewhere unfamiliar and is taking very careful stock of the situation. I held her in the delivery room while the afternoon light came through the window at an angle that made everything look like the beginning of something, which it was. And I thought about the year that had led to this specific afternoon and this specific light and this specific small person in my arms. I thought, so this is what it was all for. Not for her, exactly. I had not gone through what I went through for her benefit. She had simply been there, present and blameless, throughout the whole of it, doing the quiet work of becoming herself while the world around her conducted its drama. But she was the person on the other side of all of it, the person I was standing in the light for, the reason the solid ground mattered. My sister was there. My parents came the next morning, and my father held his granddaughter with the careful, slightly terrified tenderness of a man who had not held a baby in 26 years and was determined to do it correctly. My mother took about 40 photographs in the first hour and sent them to everyone she had ever met, which is my mother's highest form of celebration, and I received it as such. Adele came by 2 weeks after we were home, bearing a gift bag and a warmth that had become, over the past 7 months, something I genuinely counted on. She held the baby for most of the visit. My daughter, who had not yet developed opinions about most things, regarded Adele with the cautious curiosity of a person doing preliminary research, and by the end of the afternoon had tentatively approved of her, which was, given what the baby's grandmother had done, a particular and private satisfaction. Connor had not been in contact. We had no reason for contact. Everything had been handled through attorneys, cleanly and completely, the way Claire had managed it. The divorce was final. The accounts were settled. There was nothing left to say that had not been said in documents. I did not miss the conversations. I had come to understand that we had not, for most of our marriage, been having real conversations. We had been having managed ones, the kind where one person monitors and the other performs normalcy without knowing it. The absence of that was not loneliness, it was room. Renata had completed her anger management program in March. This I knew from Claire's confirmation, and from the general sense, communicated through the people who still knew them both, that Renata had found the experience considerably less bearable than the fine. 12 Thursday evenings in a church basement being asked to examine her behavior by someone who did not find her social position relevant to the examination. I hope she found something useful in it. I hold that hope without much investment in the outcome, the way you hold things that are not yours to control. I was not angry at her anymore. I want to be precise about this because I think it matters, not because I had forgiven her. Forgiveness is a specific thing and I had not gotten there yet, and I was not going to perform a forgiveness I hadn't reached because it would make a better ending. But because anger requires ongoing attention and I had better things to attend to, a daughter with opinions, a sage green nursery, a savings account growing steadily toward a house that would be mine alone, chosen alone, decorated in colors I liked, with a kitchen that got afternoon light. Anger at Renata would require me to keep giving her space in my life that she did not deserve. I had given her 2 years of effort and Sunday flowers and casserole compliments she never acknowledged. I was done allocating. There was one last thing. In August, when my daughter was 2 months old and had graduated from cautious to opinionated, in the specific way of people who have decided they have enough data to start forming preferences, I got a text from a number I didn't recognize. It said, "I don't expect a response. I just wanted you to know I'm sorry." It was unsigned, but I knew who it was from because of the number, which I had never deleted from my phone. Connor. 2 words that had taken him 8 months. I read it twice. I did not respond. Not because I was being cold, I genuinely was not cold about it, but because there was nothing useful I could add to those 2 words that would be better than letting them stand on their own. He had said what he could say. That was something, even if it was not enough, even if it arrived 8 months after the moment that would have mattered. I put my phone down and picked up my daughter, who had been lying on her activity mat regarding the ceiling mobile with the serious attention of someone reviewing important documents, and I held her in the kitchen where the afternoon light came in gold through the window, and I thought, this is what solid ground feels like. This is what it feels like to stand on it. Summer turned into fall. My daughter discovered that her hands were hers and spent 3 focused days investigating this fact. I went back to work part-time and found that I was better at it than I had been before, which sounds strange but makes sense to me. When you have spent a year learning exactly what you are made of, you show up differently, more completely, less apology. I have thought about what happened, all of it in its full shape, from the various distances that time provides, from right after when it was raw and close, from the spring when it had settled into something more manageable, from now when it has become a thing that happened, the way all things eventually become things that happened, which is the way the past becomes useful rather than just painful. Here's what I understand. Renata had spent 63 years believing that control and love were the same thing. She had raised a son alone, and she had loved him genuinely and fiercely, and somewhere in that love, she had lost the ability to distinguish between caring for someone and managing them. She had managed Connor the way she managed everything, completely, from a position of total authority, with no tolerance for outcomes she had not pre-approved. She had managed his friendships, his career decisions, his apartment choices, and she had tried to manage his marriage. When she realized she could not manage me, she did what controlling people do when management fails. She escalated. She had not thought about what would happen next. Controlling people rarely do because control requires the assumption that you will always be the most powerful person in the room. 26 witnesses are 26 witnesses. The law does not negotiate with social standing, and the people who had accepted Renata's management of their perception of events for 30 years turned out, when provided with clear and direct information, to be capable of forming their own conclusions. Connor was not a cruel man. I want to say this not to protect him. He does not need my protection and did not earn my charity, but because accuracy matters to me, and the accurate version of Connor is a man who had never been asked to choose, not really, not in a way that cost him anything significant. He had lived inside his mother's orbit for 30 years and had never needed to develop the capacity to stand outside it. When the moment came that asked him to, he did not have that capacity. He stood 6 feet away. He spent the house fund. He wrote 2 words 8 months later. He lost a marriage, a child's daily presence, a house fund, the easy, unexamined regard of people who had always liked him. He lost the version of himself as the good guy, which was the thing he had most identified with. He had chosen his mother and received in return the specific company of someone who had always preferred him manageable. I lost 2 years of Sunday flowers and casserole compliments. I lost the version of a future I had been planning. I lost the marriage, which was a real loss even if it was also a necessary one. What I gained was cleaner and more durable. I gained a daughter who holds her own hands with an expression of profound scientific interest. I gained an apartment where the couch is exactly the color I wanted, and no one has an opinion about it. I gained Adele, who came to every doctor's appointment I asked her to, and who has become one of the people I count on in the particular way you count on people who saw you clearly during the worst of it. I gained my sister, who was already mine, but who I understand better now. What it means to have someone who will take photographs in good light at the moment you need documentation, and who will also drive 4 hours to deliver a rocking chair from your grandmother, because she understands that some things need to be physically present. I gained solid ground, the kind you build yourself, with the materials of your own choices. It does not look like the ground you thought you were going to stand on. It is better, because it is actually yours. One last thing, and then I am done. The morning Renata slapped me, my hand went to my cheek before I understood why. My body knew before my mind did that something had happened that could not be undone. That knowledge, the kind that lives in the body, the kind that arrives before language, was trying to tell me something. It was telling me, pay attention. This is information. Use it. I used it. The person who does not protect you when you are most vulnerable has already given you their answer. You don't need to ask the question twice. You don't need to keep trying. You only need to hear what they are telling you. And then, with all the patience and clarity and solid ground grace you can gather, you need to go. I went. And where I went turned out to be exactly where I was supposed to be.